The world outside is growing quiet, and a story is waiting for you in the stillness. Welcome to Midnight Murmurs Studio, your safe harbor from the noise of the day. Find a comfortable place, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Before our story begins, a gentle reminder for your peaceful rest. For the deepest sleep, it's best to keep your phone at a safe distance from your head. So please take a moment to place your phone on a nearby table or chair. And while it's in your hand for this last moment, a quick tap on like and subscribe becomes a quiet signal to us, a soft murmur in the dark that lets us know these stories are a comfort to you. It's what keeps our studio going. Thank you for that. Now, settle in and let the outside world fade away.
Deep in the footholds of the Italian Alps, there was a forest unlike any other. It was known to the locals as 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐒𝐨𝐬𝐧𝐚, the forest that sings. The trees here were red spruce, tall and straight, their trunks rising like the pillars of a natural cathedral. These trees grew slowly, enduring long, harsh winters that forced their growth rings to become incredibly tight and dense. It was this density, this struggle against the cold, that gave the wood its voice. When the wind blew through the valley, the trees did not just rustle, they hummed. It was a low, resonant vibration that could be felt in the soles of one's feet, a natural frequency that had been sought after by instrument makers for centuries. On the edge of this forest, in a stone workshop that smelled perpetually of pine resin and spirit varnish, lived Master Carlo. Carlo was a luthier, a maker of stringed instruments. He was a man who lived his life by the vibration of wood. He was 80 years old, yet his hands were strong and steady, calloused from the use of gouges and planes. He wore a heavy leather apron that was stained with the colors of his trade: amber, ruby, and gold. His workshop was a sanctuary of silence and scent. The air hung heavy with the aroma of drying wood, a clean, sharp smell that cleared the mind instantly. Along the walls, violins and cellos hung in various stages of completion. Some were just bare, pale wood, looking like skeletons of music. Others were coated in their first layers of varnish, glowing under the afternoon sun that streamed through the high windows. Carlo did not use power tools. He did not believe in the scream of electric saws. He believed that to make an instrument that could sing, one had to listen to the wood while shaping it. He used hand planes that whispered against the grain. He used scrapers that removed shavings as thin as a breath. The only sounds in his shop were the friction of steel on wood and the rhythmic, meditative breathing of the master himself. He worked in a flow state, a place where time did not exist, where the only reality was the curve of the violin's belly and the smoothness of the maple back. For Carlo, making a violin was not manufacturing a product. It was releasing a voice that had been trapped inside the tree for 300 years. The road to Carlo's workshop was winding and treacherous, discouraging all but the most desperate or dedicated travelers. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, a black car pulled up the gravel driveway, looking out of place amidst the rustic surroundings. The door opened and a man stepped out. His name was Adrian. He was a renowned conductor for a major symphony orchestra in the city. He was a man who lived his life in the spotlight, standing on a podium, commanding 100 musicians with the flick of a baton. But today, he did not look like a commander. He looked defeated. Adrian walked towards the workshop door, his posture slumped. He wore a long coat that was damp with rain, and his eyes were dark with exhaustion. For the past year, Adrian had been suffering from a peculiar affliction. He had lost his ability to hear the silence between the notes. To him, music had become just noise, a chaotic wall of sound that assaulted his senses. He felt constantly out of tune, vibrating at a frequency of anxiety that made his hands shake and his heart race. He had come to Carlo not to buy an instrument, but because he had heard a rumor that the old luthier could fix things that were not made of wood. He pushed open the heavy oak door of the workshop. The bell chimed, a single clear note that hung in the air for a long time. Adrian stepped inside and stopped. The silence of the room hit him like a physical wave. It was not an empty silence. It was a resonant silence, the kind of quiet one finds inside a great library or an empty church. The smell of the varnish and the spruce wood enveloped him instantly, a sensory shift so profound that he felt dizzy. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the forest, and for the first time in months, his shoulders dropped an inch. Carlo looked up from his workbench. He was carving a scroll, the delicate spiral at the top of a violin neck. He did not speak immediately. He simply watched Adrian with eyes that were used to judging the quality of grain. He saw the tension in Adrian's jaw. He saw the way Adrian's hands twitched at his sides. He saw a man who was strung too tight, a string about to snap. "The wood is wet," Carlo said softly, his voice gravelly and warm. I am sorry," Adrian stammered, unsure of what to say. "I am Adrian. I was told you are the master of resonance. I don't know what I need, but I can't stand the noise anymore. Everything is too loud. My life is too loud." Carlo set down his carving gouge. He picked up a soft cloth and wiped the wood shavings from his hands. He walked around the workbench and stood in front of Adrian. He was a head shorter than the conductor, yet he seemed to occupy more space. "You are a musician," Carlo stated, not asking. "I can see it in your hands. But you are not listening. You are only hearing. "I hear everything," Adrian confessed, his voice rising in pitch. "That's the problem. I hear the traffic, the ventilation systems, the whispers in the audience. It's all a cacophony. I can't find the melody anymore. I feel like I'm vibrating apart." Carlo nodded slowly. He walked over to a rack where a finished violin hung. It was a magnificent instrument, the varnish glowing like a deep, liquid fire. "Do you know what makes a violin sing?" Carlo asked, touching the instrument gently. "It is not the strings. The strings just provide the energy. It is the body, the empty space inside. The wood must be strong enough to hold the tension of the strings, which exerts 40 pounds of pressure. But it must also be flexible enough to vibrate. If the wood is too thick, it is silent. If it is too thin, it collapses." He turned back to Adrian. "You, my friend, have become too rigid. You are holding the tension, but you have forgotten to vibrate. You are blocking the sound instead of letting it pass through you. You are trying to control the orchestra of your life with force, but resonance requires surrender." Adrian leaned against a sturdy wooden pillar. The truth of the words stung him. He had been trying to control everything: his career, his image, his schedule. He had become a tyrant of his own time, and in doing so, he had lost the music. "How do I fix it?" Adrian whispered. "I feel like I'm cracked." "If a violin cracks," Carlo said, "we do not throw it away. We open it up. We glue it. We reinforce it. And often, the repaired instrument sounds better than the new one. The scar adds character to the tone." He gestured to a high stool near the window. "Sit. Today, you will not conduct. You will not direct. You will simply be the wood. You will wait. You will dry out." Carlo returned to his work, but he changed his task. He moved to the back of the shop, where dusty wedges of raw wood were stacked floor to ceiling. These were the billets, pieces of spruce and maple that had been seasoning for decades. "To make a new start," Carlo said, pulling a heavy wedge of spruce from the stack. "This piece of wood was cut 50 years ago. It has been sitting in this dark corner, waiting for its turn." He carried the wood to the workbench and placed it down. It looked rough, gray, and unpromising. It looked like firewood. "It looks dead," Adrian observed from his stool. "It is dormant," Carlo corrected. "It is sleeping. It has lost its moisture. The sap has crystallized into mineral deposits within the cells. This makes the wood light and resonant. If we used fresh wood, green wood, it would be heavy and dull. It would warp. You cannot make music with green wood." He looked at Adrian meaningfully. You are in a hurry, Adrian. You want to be green. You want to grow, to produce, to be fresh. But wisdom comes from drying out. It comes from sitting in the dark for a while, letting the sap crystallize. You are in your seasoning period. Do not rush it. Carlo picked up a large two-handled knife called a draw knife. He clamped the wedge of wood into a vise. "We must remove the rough exterior," Carlo said. "We must find the straight grain underneath." He began to pull the knife towards him. The blade bit into the gray, weathered surface of the spruce. With a sound that was both tearing and slicing, a deep, textural whack, a long strip of wood peeled away. Underneath the gray skin, the wood was a creamy, brilliant white. It smelled intensely of pine needles and history. Adrian watched the knife work, the rhythmic motion of Carlo's arms, the sound of the wood being peeled, the sight of the clean, fresh surface emerging from the old gray block. It was mesmerizing. He felt a strange sympathy with the wood. He imagined himself being clamped in a vise, having his own gray, tired layers peeled away to reveal something clean and white underneath. The noise in his head began to recede, replaced by the rhythmic sound of the draw knife. Pull, peel, release. The spruce had been split and glued to form the rough shape of the violin's top plate. It sat on the workbench, a solid, heavy wedge of potential. Carlo picked up a gouge, a heavy chisel with a curved U-shaped blade. It was razor sharp, the steel gleaming in the dim light of the workshop. "To make space for the music," Carlo said, positioning the gouge against the wood, "we must remove what is unnecessary. We must create a hollow. A violin is not a solid object, Adrian. It is a container for air. The sound lives in the emptiness." He pushed the gouge. The blade bit into the spruce with a satisfying, shearing sound. A thick chip of wood curled up and flew off, landing softly on the floor. Carlo established a rhythm. Push, scoop, flick. Push, scoop, flick. The motion was repetitive and hypnotic, like the rowing of a boat. With each pass of the tool, the flat surface of the wood was transformed into a landscape of valleys and ridges. He was digging out the heart of the wood, lightening the load, turning a heavy block into a thin, resonant shell. Adrian watched the pile of wood chips grow. They were pale and curled, smelling intensely of fresh sap and ancient forests. He found his eyes following the flight of each chip. There was something profoundly relieving about seeing material being removed. In his own life, he was always adding responsibilities, adding appointments, adding noise. Here, the process was about subtraction. It was about taking away everything that wasn't the violin. "You are watching the weight fall away," 𝐬𝐿 murmured, not breaking his rhythm. "The wood is becoming lighter. It is losing its mass so it can gain its voice. If it remains heavy, it will be mute. It must become thin, almost dangerously thin, to vibrate. Vulnerability is the price of resonance." Adrian thought about his own thickness, the walls he had built around himself to survive the critics and the pressure. He realized those walls were keeping him safe, but they were also keeping him silent. He was solid, but he wasn't singing. He watched the gouge carve deeper, wondering if he, too, could survive being hollowed out. Once the heavy lifting was done with the gouge, 𝐬𝐿 switched to a smaller, more delicate tool. It was a finger plane, a tiny, brass-bodied instrument no larger than a walnut. It fit perfectly into the palm of his hand. "Now we refine," 𝐬𝐿 said. "The gouge is for force. The plane is for feeling." He pushed the tiny plane across the arched surface of the wood. Unlike the large chips from the gouge, the plane produced shavings that were gossamer thin. They were translucent ribbons of wood, curling up like delicate lace. The sound changed from a heavy chopping noise to a high, whispering shh, shh, shh. It was a gentle, abrasive sound, like wind passing through dry grass. 𝐬𝐿 worked in spirals, moving from the center of the plate outwards. He closed his eyes frequently, running his thumb over the wood to feel for high spots and imperfections that his eyes might miss. He was reading the wood with his skin. "The grain changes direction here," 𝐬𝐿 noted, adjusting the angle of the plane. "You cannot force it. If you go against the grain, the wood tears. You must go with the flow of the fiber. You must respect the direction the tree wants to go." Adrian sat mesmerized by the pile of lace-like shavings accumulating on the bench. They looked like fallen petals. The air in the shop was now thick with gold dust and floating wood fibers dancing in the shafts of sunlight. The atmosphere was one of intense, quiet industry. There was no rush to finish. The goal wasn't the finished violin. The goal was the perfect curve. Adrian felt his breathing slow down to match the shh of the plane. The chaotic orchestra in his head, the violin screeching, the brass blaring, began to fade. In its place, there was just this one singular whispering note of the steel blade against the spruce. It was a solo performance of patience. After an hour of planing, 𝐬𝐿 stopped. He brushed the shavings off the wooden plate. It was now a beautiful, arched shell, thin and graceful. He held it up by a single corner, letting it hang freely in the air. "Now," 𝐬𝐿 whispered, We ask it to speak. He brought the wood close to his ear. He curled his knuckled index finger and tapped the center of the plate. Thumb. It wasn't a dull thud. It was a musical note. It was low, warm, and resonant, like a distant drum or a bell heard underwater. The wood rang. It held the vibration for a second longer than seemed possible for a piece of timber. "Do you hear that?" Carlo asked, his eyes shining. "That is the tap tone. That is the fundamental frequency of this piece of wood. Every tree has a different note. Some sing in F, some in G. We do not choose the note. We discover it." He handed the plate to Adrian. "You try. Hold it gently. Do not choke it. Let it hang." Adrian took the wood. It felt incredibly light, almost like holding a large dry leaf. He was terrified of dropping it. He held it up to his ear. He tapped it. Thumb. The vibration traveled from the wood through his fingertips and up his arm. It resonated in his own chest. It was a pure, clean sound. It was the sound of nature responding to a question. "It sings," Adrian whispered, a look of wonder crossing his tired face. "It actually sings." "It sings because it is empty," Carlo said, "and because it is tuned. We carve the wood until the tap tone is clear. If the note is muddy, we carve more. We keep removing the excess until the voice is pure. You must find your tap tone, Adrian. You must find the one note that is truly yours and tune everything else out." The plate was tuned. It rang true. Now it needed a way to breathe. Carlo placed the plate back on the workbench. He picked up a template and traced two elegant S-shaped curves onto the front of the violin. These were the F holes. "These are the eyes," Carlo said, picking up a thin, pointed knife. "They allow the sound to escape the box. Without them, the vibration is trapped inside, echoing endlessly until it dies. You must have an outlet, Adrian." He began to cut. This was surgery. There was no room for error. One slip of the knife would ruin weeks of work. Carlo gripped the knife like a pen. He inserted the point into the wood and began to trace the curve. The knife moved with agonizing slowness. It severed the grain fibers cleanly. There was no sound now, just the intense, heavy silence of concentration. The tension in the room rose, but it wasn't the bad tension of stress. It was the good tension of focus. Adrian watched the tip of the knife. He held his breath. He saw the elegant scroll of the F-hole emerge from the wood. It was a shape of perfect balance, a mathematical curve that looked organic. Carlo finished the cut. He pushed the small piece of waste wood out. It fell away, leaving a dark, perfectly shaped hole. "The breath is released," 𝐲𝐿 exhaled, setting the knife down. He held the plate up to the window. The light streamed through the F-holes, illuminating the empty space inside. The violin top looked like a face now, staring back at them with wisdom. "It is open," 𝐲𝐿 said. "It is vulnerable. And because it is open, it can project its voice to the back of the concert hall. You have been holding your breath for too long, maestro. You need to cut your own F-holes. You need to let the sound out." Adrian looked at the open pores of the wood. He felt a lump in his throat. He realized he had been stifling his own voice, conducting others' music, but never letting his own spirit resonate. The sight of the clean, sharp cuts in the pale wood gave him a strange sense of permission. Permission to open up. Permission to let the air in. The body of the violin was closed. The front plate had been glued to the ribs and the back, forming a sealed, hollow chamber of air. It was pale, naked wood, vulnerable to the elements. Now it needed its skin. 𝐲𝐿 brought out a jar of varnish. It was a recipe that had been handed down through generations, a mixture of linseed oil, pine resin, and pigments that had been cooked slowly over a fire until they turned the color of deep, oxidized honey. The smell was intoxicating, rich, oily, and sharp, with the scent of turpentine and lavender oil used as a solvent. 𝐲𝐿 dipped a wide, flat brush made of soft badger hair into the jar. He lifted it, letting the excess varnish drip back down in a slow, viscous thread. He applied the brush to the wood. The pale spruce drank the oil instantly. As the varnish touched the surface, a magical transformation occurred. The grain of the wood, which had been subtle and faint, suddenly popped into three-dimensional life. The flames of the maple back shimmered like a hologram, shifting in the light as 𝐲𝐿 moved the instrument. "Varnish does not just protect," 𝐲𝐿 murmured, his brush moving in long, fluid strokes from the neck to the tail. "It enhances. It reveals the character that was hiding underneath. But it must be applied in thin layers, many thin layers. If you put it on too thick, it chokes the sound. It dampens the vibration. Patience, Adrian. We must let each layer dry in the sun before we add the next." Adrian watched the application of the golden liquid. It was mesmerizing. The wood was glowing now, radiating a warmth that seemed to come from within. He thought of his own life, how he had tried to cover up his insecurities with thick, heavy layers of bravado and noise. 𝐲𝐿 was teaching him transparency. The varnish was clear. It didn't hide the wood, it celebrated it. The process was slow, meditative, and silent. There was no rush to finish, only a desire to cover every millimeter in liquid gold. Once the varnish was dry and polished to a soft satin sheen, it was time for the assembly. This was the moment where physics met art. Carlo placed the sound post inside the violin, a small dowel of spruce that connected the top plate to the back plate. In Italian, we call this l'anima, whispered, the soul. If you move it 1 millimeter to the left, the violin becomes bright. 1 millimeter to the right, it becomes dark. It carries the vibration from the front to the back. It connects the face to the spine. Next came the bridge, a delicate carved piece of maple that stood on the belly of the instrument. And finally, the strings. Carlo threaded the 4 strings, G, D, A, E, into the tailpiece and wound them around the ebony pegs. He began to turn the pegs. The strings tightened. "This is tension," Carlo said, feeling the resistance of the peg. "You are afraid of tension, Adrian. You think stress is bad. But look, without tension, the string is flabby. It makes no sound. It is useless. To make music, you need stress. You need 40 pounds of pressure bearing down on the bridge. But," he paused, adjusting the bridge slightly, "but it must be balanced. The wood pushes up, the strings push down. It is an equilibrium. You do not need to eliminate the stress in your life. You just need to balance the structure so it can hold the weight without breaking." Adrian watched the strings become taut. He realized he had been trying to cut the strings of his life to stop the noise, but he didn't need to cut them. He needed to tune them. He needed to find the right pitch where the tension became energy, not destruction. The violin was strung. It was tuned. It sat on the workbench, gleaming under the oil lamps, a masterpiece of tension and potential. "Play it," Carlo commanded softly. He handed Adrian a bow, tightening the horsehair until it was ready. Adrian hesitated. His hands, which had conducted Mahler and Beethoven, felt clumsy. He picked up the violin. It felt light, lighter than any instrument he had ever held. It felt alive against his collarbone. He raised the bow. He didn't try to play a symphony. He didn't try to show off. He simply placed the bow on the open D string and drew it downwards. A sound filled the room. It was not just a note. It was a texture. It started as a whisper of horsehair on steel, then bloomed into a warm, woody, resonant tone that seemed to expand in all directions. It was rich and dark, like chocolate or old wine. The vibration traveled through the chin rest, into Adrian's jaw, down his spine, and into the floor. He didn't just hear it, he became part of the circuit. He played the A string, then the E. The notes hung in the air, clear and bell-like, fading away slowly into the silence. For the first time in a year, Adrian heard the space between the notes. The silence wasn't empty. It was the canvas upon which the music was painted. The noise in his head, the critics, the schedules, the fear was gone. There was only the vibration of the spruce and the beating of his own heart. "You hear it?" Carlo asked from the shadows. "That is your voice. It was there all along. It just needed a better box." Adrian lowered the bow. Tears streamed down his face, hot and releasing. "It sings," he whispered. "I can hear the silence again." "Keep the instrument," Carlo said. "Take it back to the concert hall. But remember, do not force the music. Let the wood do the work. You are just the bow." Adrian left the workshop as evening settled over the Alps. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet pine needles and ozone. The sky was a deep indigo canvas scattered with the first stars of the night. He placed the violin case on the passenger seat of his car, strapping it in like a precious passenger. He didn't turn on the radio. He drove down the winding mountain road in silence. But it was a comfortable silence now. It was a silence that hummed with potential. He realized that he could go back to his life, back to the podium, but he would do it differently. He wouldn't be a wall of stone trying to block the noise. He would be a vessel of spruce, letting the sound pass through him, resonant and open. Back in the workshop, Carlo tidied his bench. He swept the wood shavings into a pile. He wiped the varnish brush and capped the jar of spirit. The smell of the resin lingered, a scent of preservation. He walked to the window and watched the taillights of Adrian's car disappear into the valley. The forest outside was quiet, the trees standing tall in the moonlight, growing their tight rings, preparing the wood for the next century of songs. Carlo turned off the lamps. The workshop filled with shadows. He sat in his chair, his hands resting on his knees. He listened to the house settling, the wood creaking softly as it cooled. His breathing slowed. The rhythm of the gouge and the plane played in his mind like a lullaby. The luthier closed his eyes, his work done, the voice released, and drifted into a deep, harmonious sleep, tuned perfectly to the frequency of the night.
And so, our story comes to a gentle close. May your mind be calm and your dreams be kind. If you're still listening, we'll be waiting for you here again with another story from Midnight Murmurs Studio. Until then, sleep well.